Please welcome back to the stage Bloomberg's Eric Schatzker.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Bloomberg New Economy at B20. I hope you have enjoyed our breakout sessions. We're just about to begin the afternoon program here. The breakouts are one of the most popular things we do at Bloomberg New Economy, and now you know why, because they allow all of us to switch gears from being in the audience to becoming participants in the conversation. We're just about to get to Bill Gates. You're going to see him up here on the screen in just a moment with Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite. But before we go there, I wanted to reflect on a few of this morning's highlights. Karine Saja reminding Brazilians that can't be too inward-looking if they want to attract the foreign capital this country so badly needs to develop. Nubank CEO David Vélez saying he's taking a fresh look at Argentina because of the success of President Javier Milei's economic shock therapy. Hermínio Fraga, the former president of Brazil's central bank, admonishing his compatriots for losing sight of their moral and cultural values in pursuit of geopolitical optionality through non-alignment. Wesley Batista illustrating in vivid detail just how much more expensive it is to do business here in Brazil than it is in the United States. And U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai warning Brazil of the risks inherent in joining China's Belt and Road Infrastructure Investment Program. Also coming up this afternoon, a terrific panel with the Honorable Marcela Escobari, Special Assistant on Migration to President Biden, JBS CEO Gilberto Tomazoni, and Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever. That is going to be one heck of a panel. I'll be here doing a one-on-one with Andreas Stevas, chairman of Latin America's biggest investment bank, BTG Pactual. And don't forget, of course, the closing reception. I will be reminding you of this again at 6 p.m. upstairs on the second floor at Casa Bradesco. Now, folks, let's get on with the program.
Please welcome Bill Gates, Chair, Gates Foundation, and founder, Breakthrough Energy, and John Micklethwaite, Editor-in-Chief, Bloomberg.
Hi, Bill. Thank you again for doing the New Economy Forum. We'll begin, I think, on greenery. And I've just read your new State of the Transition report. And in that, you start with a bold claim that basically the climate business in 2024 reminds you, or seems at the same inflection point that medicine was back in 2020 when you began the whole vaccines drive. And your argument is that we now have most of the technologies we need to fight climate change or to deal with climate. And I wondered, perhaps you can just give us a couple of examples. I know that you talk about a lot of technologies like clean hydrogen, aviation fuel, and so on, but just give us a couple of examples of why you think that, because it's a very big claim.
Well, my key theory of change on climate is that if the clean approach, the green approach, is more expensive, that we won't get global adoption. Perhaps rich countries will subsidize clean approaches, but as you get into the middle income countries like Brazil, India, and others, they would say, hey, we're not responsible for the historic emissions, and so slowing down our providing basic capabilities to our population, that we shouldn't be impeded. And so the way to square this is to innovate in all the areas of emissions so that the new approach that's clean costs less. That's either a zero green premium or literally a negative green premium. And that's what Breakthrough Energy was founded to do. We have 130 companies. A good example is one that's working on the way that steel is made. They're called Boston Metals. They're actually working with partners in Brazil to build a plant there that looks like it'll be able to make very competitive steel, but in a very, very clean way. You know, we have geothermal, company called Fervo. We have people who make windows called Luxwall. That means you don't have to heat or cool your building as much. You know, so these 130 companies are driving forward this innovative approach, and we still have a lot of work to do to take things that some of which are just at the lab, some of which are still quite expensive, but volume is needed to bring the cost down, like we saw with solar panels and batteries. But we're on our way. We've got the IQ of the world, and in every one of the areas of emission, I see a path to zero, which means we can get adoption where we need it.
I'm quite interested. You've backed quite a lot of green startups. There are a lot of people in this audience who are involved in that industry. You know, some of them get to scale, some of them don't. Have you reached any conclusion about what is the factor for success?
Well, everything is very domain dependent. You know, I had to learn a lot about the history of steel making, or you know, different approaches for making cement, you know, to understand, okay, why has that stayed the same for so long? And now that we're getting lots of new people looking at that, what are these new techniques? You know, teaming up with large companies, working in multiple geographies. It's very, you know, it's very science-based. It's, you know, fun to meet those innovators. It's more capital intensive than, say, the digital revolution. And, you know, we can't underestimate that means that the scale is tough. You know, we can run into geopolitical barriers sometimes, but on the whole, you know, even though we won't meet the highest goals, we will start to get emissions down, and we'll avoid this being the primary thing that's slowing down human development.
About nuclear, you've been a big backer of nuclear through things. I looked up kind of Google, Amazon, Microsoft, as you know. They're all beginning to invest money in nuclear things. Do you think the wind is changing? I suppose that's a bad metaphor, but do you think that there is a change in the way people are looking at this?
Well, there's certainly a number of countries, including the United States, where both the public attitudes and the level of investment in nuclear fission are quite positive. You know, at the COP28, a lot of countries came together and talked about tripling nuclear over the future. So that's very different than going into decline. There's a big challenge, though, which is those third generation plants. They have a lot of pressure, they're very expensive, they're very complex. So there's a question, can we get to this fourth generation? And so you have a number of companies trying to usher in much simpler designs, including the one I'm involved in called TerraPower. There's several other companies doing that. But yes, the fact that the tech companies want to be customers for green energy, and at least for a period of time, they're willing to pay a bit of a premium. And as the volume of reactors go up, then that premium goes away. That is extremely helpful to reboot the nuclear industry around these fourth generation plants.
There is an issue, though, isn't there? That a lot of the attention has been on small modular reactors, or kind of reviving old ones rather than building big new ones. Is that a problem? It looks at it from the outside, but I don't know.
Well, if you get small, you can do a lot of your labor off-site, which is advantageous, but it also means your efficiency is a lot less. And so the approach TerraPower is using is to have a medium-sized reactor, 345 megawatt electric. In our roadmap, if utilities do want big ones, those are somewhat more efficient. But first we want to build dozens of our medium-sized reactor, and we've been able to move some of the labor off-site, although we still have some on-site. But size, it's very tricky to get the efficiency as you get small, because it's the kind of the volume of the reactor is your value and the surface area is your cost. So different people are taking different approaches, and of course we have digital design and simulation that is letting us build far, far simpler plants than ever before.
What about fusion, I know it's a question I think I probably ask you once every 5 years. Do you think that is, it always seems to be 5 years away, or at least that, is it now getting closer at all? There have been one or two people recently suddenly saying there's possibilities.
Yeah, so Breakthrough Energy, where almost all my climate work is, and I'm the largest investor in,
Yeah.
we funded 4 different fusion companies. The one that's furthest along is pretty fantastic, called Commonwealth Fusion Systems. That's a spin-off essentially from MIT, and they're hard at work building their prototype facility outside of Boston. And so it's, you could say it's about 6 to 10 years behind the 4th generation fission. But it has a lot of advantages, and over time it could be even less expensive. And so we're backing these companies, and they're even using very advanced software to simulate how they work. So in the long run, fission and fusion will be a substantial part of power generation, complementing the renewables that are being built at high speed.
Can I just contrast, because you've sort of alluded to it a couple of times, the kind of gap between all the kind of business optimism, the scientific possibilities that are now opening up, with the political realities which seem to be going in the opposite direction. Just to give you an example, you played quite a big role in getting the Inflation Reduction Act through in America. You if Trump comes in, what do you think is the most endangered technology out of the stuff that managed to get
to be built in red states? And so ideally we'll get some bipartisan defense of what's being done there. I do think nuclear is particularly bipartisan because it has to do with energy security as well as climate. But you could have some things like the electric vehicle tax credit or the green electricity tax credits. You could have them come under attack. I think they're a good thing. I think they're ushering in new industries. The general idea that taxpayers are going to pay a lot of extra money for products because they want to reduce emissions, that has been pushed hard enough that there really is a backlash. We see that in Europe, we see that in the US, and that's why this theory of innovation is the only way you square the imperative to get rid of the emissions, but without having people say, hey, I'm not going to pay for it. And actually, that can even influence elections if you push too hard.
Do you think that thing, though, on the demand side, in a strange way, the demand kick has been given? Now these technologies are underway. It wouldn't be terrible it wouldn't help if they went away, but it would, if those kind of reliefs were taken away.
Well, you have different levels of maturity. And so, I'd say that electric vehicles, even without the subsidies, over time, they are going, even for the people who park on the street, the low end, they will get to a zero green premium. You have things, particularly industrial emissions like steel, cement, that we're just building the pilot plants now. And so without governmental policy and support, the transition of the industrial emissions would slow down a lot. And that's very unfortunate if that takes place. Likewise, in transportation, airlines are the toughest part of all of the emissions, and they're without support that'll get pushed back.
Can I ask you one kind of strangely capitalism-related question? I mean, you have arguably been one of the world's, well, you've definitely been one of the world's most successful capitalists of the past 25, 30, 40 years. Last week, I sat on a stage with Donald Trump, and he said that he wanted to introduce tariffs, 10, 20% on everywhere. And his argument was this was very good for American business. In your experience, does that make sense?
No, it's certainly not the case. And the difficulty of convincing voters that free trade is overwhelmingly to their benefit, it's unfortunate how difficult it is to make that case. And so, I understand a politician who chooses to take advantage of that, but we will suffer overall. Welfare will improve less, as not only will, if the U.S. puts tariffs on, of course, other people will put tariffs on as well, and the economic dynamism, speed of innovation will be significantly slowed.
Just to push you on that dynamism point, it's very easy to make the argument that this means higher prices for consumers, but this issue of dynamism, you've been involved in entrepreneurship, these things most of your life. If you have less foreign competition, less foreign goods, that must have an impact on it. I know it's back to a creed you've believed in, but in practice, is that argument possible to make to voters?
Well, we should find articulate politicians who can make the case. If you take most of the industries I think about, like inventing a new drug or writing a new piece of software or birthing a new climate technology, you have these gigantic fixed costs. And the fact that you can do that work and then sell it on a global basis means that everybody's getting faster innovation and lower prices. And if you start to fragment markets because of either tariffs or regulatory barriers to that trade, it absolutely takes away the lower prices and high-speed innovation.
You mentioned health. It struck me, maybe this is unfair, but health is kind of the opposite to climate, is that at least there were incredible health gains in the early 2000s. It seems to have stalled a bit. What's needed to create another global health boom?
Well, I'm actually quite optimistic. Both the diseases in lower income countries and the diseases in rich countries, we are seeing incredible advances, whether it's obesity drugs, long-acting drugs. Gene editing is still super expensive, but the Gates Foundation is putting a lot of money into trying to get that from millions of dollars to hundreds of dollars, so we can take a disease like sickle cell that's prominent in Africa. And as we do that, it'll benefit all the world's health systems. And then, of course, AI will be applied in health in the upstream discovery piece to speed up new drugs, but it'll also be applied in the downstream delivery, sitting in the sessions with doctors, helping with follow-up, helping with paperwork. And so I think the health sector will be an exemplar that AI can improve things quite dramatically.
There's one thing which is a little bit similar is that issue, and you did it in your Netflix series, this issue of trust. Is that there are these things that appear very logical to do with health, and yet people don't seem to believe it, COVID being the obvious example. How do we deal with this sort of deficit of trust when it comes to health? Is it just to do with a deficit of trust in governments, or is it broader than that?
Well, certainly I never expected, as the pandemic came along, that many people had warned about, the idea that people would reach for oversimplistic explanations, like attacking either myself or Tony Fauci or, attacking the idea of vaccines. I wouldn't have expected that. And certainly a lot of people, particularly older people who should have been vaccinated, were not. So, those rumors, literally caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. I'm hopeful with that out of the way that we can go back to, a more scientific way of looking at health innovation. When people see the effects of things like these obesity drugs, it should remind them that, we can improve health pretty dramatically.
I agree. The obesity drugs are a very good example in one direction. On the other hand, you have stuff about, I don't know, hurricanes and things like that. You still see that basic trust that people used to have in, quote unquote, scientists and government it's amazingly small compared with what it was 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, there's like these latest hurricanes, some people blame me for those too. I'm very busy, but hopefully, the basic decisions about what's safe and what's beneficial, we maintain that. And, I think positive progress will help get people back, looking at what experts are telling them the truth is.
One quick thing on health, the mosquito-borne diseases seem to be a little bit back on the rise. Dengue and the West Nile stuff, people. Are you worried about that? I mean, it just seems to be a slight blip in an otherwise very positive picture.
Yeah, of course, the biggest part of that, which is kind of invisible in middle income and rich countries, is the malaria burden, which is killing about 600,000 kids a year.
Yeah.
Where you are in Brazil, dengue's gone up somewhat. We do have new tools to reduce mosquito populations, one that's still in the lab called Gene Drive that the Gates Foundation funds and should help us with all those mosquito-borne diseases. What we see is when you get a lot of flooding, which you get a bit more of with climate change, mosquitoes really thrive. And so places like Pakistan, where you had very little malaria, then when they had the flooding, now it's come back in a pretty big way. And so, that innovation pipeline is coming along. It should get even more money, but we will be able to get rid of those vector-borne diseases in countries that want to embrace these new tools.
I'll ask you one last question about Brazil. I mean, this is a place we've heard where, especially on the climate side, a very, very high proportion, probably higher than anywhere else, certainly above 90%, coming from renewable sources. Do you see Brazil as the center of this climate? It seems to be the center of both the pain in the Amazon, but also on the creative side. Is that something you've been following?
Well, certainly at the UN General Assembly, the Gates Foundation had our Goalkeepers event, and I gave an award to President Lula for the work they've done in reducing malnutrition. We've been talking with Brazil a lot about COP30 that's coming up, and that'll be a very important milestone both for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Brazil has done some good pioneering things on mitigation. The deforestation, it's important that get under control both for Brazil itself and for the world. So there's a lot being learned there. As I said, one of our best breakthrough companies is building a steel plant with partners in Brazil. So yes, agriculture innovation with Embrapa, Brazil is very strong. So it's fantastic, that the issue is a very important issue, and it deals with kind of the equity things that Brazil's been a global leader on.
Just one last thing on that, particularly on Brazil. Are you now much more, it sounds like you're more optimistic about Brazil than maybe if you and I talked about it 20, 30 years ago. It's a more positive story?
Well, Brazil's got a lot of assets, and it's kind of a mixed story because they've had challenges with governance, and who knows, they're like the U.S. They have a party that's sort of against all climate things and for Amazon destruction, and you have a party who cares about that. So I'm not an expert on what the balance will end up being over time. The whole world has this problem that we do need to invest. And Amazon forest destruction, we're very good at measuring it now because of satellite systems, but the exact policies that will get us there, still somewhat challenging, particularly as you get different parties in power.
Bill, thank you very much for talking to us again. Covered many, many subjects. Thank you very much on behalf of everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage the Honorable Marcela Escobari, Coordinator for the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection, Special Assistant to the President at National Security Council, United States of America. Paul Pullman, business leader, campaigner, and co-author of Net Positive. Gilberto Tomazoni, Global CEO, JBS, and Julia Leite, Managing Editor of Emerging Markets, Bloomberg.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, panelists. Thank you so much for your time here with us. So, the prosperity predicament. Big, lofty topic. Lots of threads to pull on. 30 minutes. We'll see a countdown clock here. Very menacing somewhere. Tomazoni, I wanted to start with you. World's largest meat producer. You come in very much on the supply-demand side of this equation, right? With the rising standards of living, more people coming out of poverty, there's more demand for meat. There's only so much pastures, only so much meat, so many cows. How do you transition the current food system to a more sustainable model?
The technology we already have, it is possible to transition. We have examples that when you have applied renewable agriculture in a way that you put together, you combine grain production with livestock, in forests, you can produce in the same area 15% more food and to be carbon positive. It is already exist. We have some farmers that do that. The challenge that we have, and we have discussed this in the B20, that is we need to create access to the small farmers to this technology. That they be past this innovation of technology we have to the small farmers with technical assistance. This is the two things, technology, innovation, go to the small farmers with technical assistance. And to do that, we need to find a way to finance that. The farmers need some money, affordable money, maturity time for money, to adopt this new technology. And besides of that, technology, money, times to the money, tax of the money, we need to have assurance from the farmers because they invest their life in the farms. And I believe that this is possible. Brazil is doing that. The government of Brazil, if the farmers adopt regenerative agriculture, they can reduce the tax. It is possible, and we are doing that. The technology is available. It's just the amount of money we need in the technical system.
Perfect. And Paul, to you, of course, it's not just the food system that we need to make more sustainable. What do we need to do to finally get to this? It kind of seems like we've been talking about it for a couple decades, and everybody kind of knows largely what they need to do. Why are we not there yet?
Well, so I'm glad we're talking the food system because obviously the energy transition is very important, and you've heard Bill talk about it, although he's a little bit too focused on technology is the only part that will get us there. I think it's a little bit more than that. but also to have the food system be part of this is now well accepted. 30% of the emissions are coming from our food system. It's also actually 30% of the solutions, so a 60% swing with actually the lowest investments and the fastest results. That's why people are getting more interested in it. How can you stop deforestation, the methane, the degrading of the land, the fertilizer, all these elements of heavy emissions? And it needs to be higher on the agenda, and it is increasingly so. So we've lifted many people out of poverty over the last few decades with our economic system, and we've been sleeping at the wheel a little bit because it was going well. We had great statistics. Most of the Millennial Development Goals were achieved 2 years ahead of target, halving the number of people in poverty. Then we got the Sustainable Development Goals, enthusiastic, the agreement, then immediately the Paris 2015 COP21. So there was this momentum. What we did not really foresee was the quick lifting of people out of poverty, was this linear, fairly destructive, extractive production model. Only 8% of the things we produce gets reused. Most of it incinerated, landfills, oceans increasingly. It's just not sustainable. This world was made for probably 4 or 5 billion people, but not the 8 billion people. And it's catching up on us. You know, I always said you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, and anything you can't do forever is by definition unsustainable. So we've been surprised as human beings at the speed. We're linear thinkers, we have an exponential problem. And exponential problems require exponential solutions. We got a little tip of that during COVID, but we haven't really fully absorbed that or internalized that. The beauty now is, to be honest, which is a sad situation, what I'm going to tell you, that so many things are coming together now that we are finally starting to understand that the system is really broken. You have the geopolitical tensions, you have the political tensions in the countries itself, you have the revolution of AI, you have increasing climate disasters being thrown at us, disruptions in the value chain, and the list goes on. People are starting to discover now that the cost of not acting is actually becoming higher than the cost of acting. So this is where the beauty lies, that we are not putting a bandage on there, like we did during the financial crisis or during COVID, but that we now look holistically, and more people are asking themselves, what do we need to do to reboot these economies and to change them fundamentally? And all of a sudden, the economic forces are driving you there, frankly. Technology helps. Government regulation that you see increasingly coming to the foreground helps. Signals from the marketplace are increasingly becoming clear. So the businesses that understand that and are leading increasingly are getting rewarded for that also by the financial market because they're positioning themselves in a way. Now, what gets in the way? First of all, we're moving $1.8 trillion green energy, up 50% versus a year ago. This year, up again another 30. We've talked solar, we talked wind, we talked batteries, electric vehicles. Many of these things are close to tipping points. But we've discovered, because we waited so long, that we need to invest 4 times more than we currently do. So how do we unlock that money? Challenge, first of all, business itself. Are we ambitious enough? Because we're doing significantly more than my predecessor doesn't mean we do enough. So ambition is lacking in business. Because of all these crises, most of the CEOs are pulled back to the short term when we deal here with strategic, fundamental, longer term issues. So that's a challenge. The second one is governments, because the governments really and the multilateral institutions are in a difficult situation. We deal with symptoms, but not with underlying causes. We have perverse regulations in most countries. We still have $7 trillion of perverse subsidies on fossil fuel. We have in the, in Brazil, we have $58 billion of fossil fuel subsidies in the last 5 years, 7 times more than what we spent on green energy. So you get what you're asking for. We see the same in the food system, by the way, perverse subsidies pushing us in the wrong direction. So government clarity of policy, government ambition is very important. And business needs to help give the governments courage to do that. And then the flow of money needs to significantly increase, especially to the emerging markets. Unfortunately, of all the climate investments, only 7% goes to the emerging markets. So the discussions that we now have in Baku, which is called the Climate COP, or at the World Bank meetings right now in Washington, next week in Cali at the Biodiversity COP, is how do you unlock that money? By all means possible, because I think governments are starting to discover as well it's better to spend a little bit more money creating the right, more equitable, more sustainable economy that also works for future generations, and save yourself increasingly the costs that are now being wasted, to be honest.
And I'll take from there to Marcela, from your perch in the government, do you agree with this view? What do you think?
Look, I mean, everything that my panelist said is right on in terms of our global challenges. I think when you think about the original question of sustainable development or inclusive growth, let me honor the title of the conundrum or the predicament on growth. And I think fundamentally, we need growth to lift people out of poverty. But also, growth is exclusive by nature. It basically happens where capabilities aggregate, where you have people, where you have infrastructure, where you have talent. So it tends to happen in cities. It tends to happen where these capabilities can aggregate and people get left behind, right? So you actually, to make growth inclusive, you have to be very purposeful to link people in the periphery into networks that make them more productive. And these networks can be physical, water and roads. More and more, they're virtual, right? Access to finance, we had that conversation. The hardest ones to scale are social networks. Poor people hang out with poor people, they don't grow, right? So I think you do need government, you do need regulation, because to incentivize that last mile investment to really integrate people. And then, of course, you need an environment, which I think has been created in Brazil with the central bank, where innovation flourishes, where some of those disruptive technologies can really disrupt all industries so that inclusion can happen faster.
And we were talking a little bit about the importance not just of regulation, but of appropriate, targeted, correct regulation, right? Not just go out regulating everything, but be targeted about what you're doing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, probably one of the clearest correlations is richer countries have more regulation, but precise regulation. And that's the role of the private sector, to really inform the public sector on how to regulate in a way so that you can have a functional market.
Paul, do you think we do that appropriately today?
So where we are currently, it's very difficult for individual companies to attack the challenges at the speed and scale that is needed. Perhaps only 20% can now be done by individual companies, usually a little bit more greening in scope 1 and scope 2. Increasingly, the legislation pushes you to scope 3. The European Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive is an example of that. So increasingly, we need to look at these partnerships that need to be formed. And as the political environment is difficult, and you do need at the end the right frameworks to operate, it is very important that you get the coalition of businesses that are responsible to help de-risk these political processes. We saw that happen in Europe with the nature protection law, for example, where we have 150 companies, 160 companies that went to Brussels and said, despite moving more to the right in your elections, we still want you to protect nature, because otherwise the cost that we're getting in our businesses is significantly higher. We saw the same with the Green Deal. People don't like regulation, but it's better to have the right regulation than getting increasingly an amalgamation of things because we're not addressing these issues. So business needs to move from lobbying, which is very much a disease right now. $6 billion goes to Washington, and it's all doing it for your own self-interest, to what I call, in my book Net Positive, I call it positive advocacy, where we work together and say, what do we need to do to clean up the mess in the fashion industry and pay people decently in the value chain, ensure that we don't pollute the water, be sure that we protect and restore biodiversity instead of destroying it. We were 2% sustainable cotton 10, 20, 30 years ago. We're 2% today. The only difference is we use 10 times more cotton. So the 98% has become 10 times worse. That's why climate change goes up. That's why there's more plastics in the oceans. That's why we have more inequality. So business needs to say, I'm responsible for that, but I'm not only responsible for that, it's in my interest to change it, and I'll help you put the right policies in place. And unfortunately, we don't have enough courageous leaders that are willing to do that. The average tenure of a CEO is now 4.5 years. The moment they get the jobs, they're thinking on how can I get into my retirement mode. So it's hard work. It's not easy, these things. But I always tell people, what's the alternative? Give me a better alternative, and I'll spend as much, if not more, energy for that.
Tomazoni, I wanted to ask you about the behavior of the consumer. At JBS, what do you, if you put a label, a green label, you know, of this is raised sustainably, this cattle had reduced emissions, and you have to pay a little bit more. Do you find that people do that today more than they did maybe 10 years ago?
Our experience that the consumer, they don't want to pay the bill for the transformation. If you bring the same product, one is less carbon footprint, and you charge a little bit more, consumer not take it. Consumer, they don't want to pay the bill for this transformation. In reality, the solutions is to transform the system. We know that to be sustainable is more efficient than the way that we produce today. This is clear. If you are more sustainable, you are more efficient. The transformation will take some time. And then the only way to solve this is through the coalitions, the government, the companies, the social civility, the academy. We need to work together in order that. But the main issue, to push action, we need to have money. Today, just 40% of the investment to tackle the climate change go to agriculture and the food system. And we know that food system has the potential to capture 23% of the all emissions of the global emissions. Means that if we invest there, you have the solutions to tackle the climate. But so far, we don't have these attitudes, and we don't have these visions from that. And we are not, our company, we are JBS, we are focused on to be more sustainable because our core is biogenic. We need to invest there. It's not because it's for the future of the company. I know that it's the future of the planet. It's because it's better for the consumers. And the farms, they want to adopt this technology because it's more productive from them. We need to create conditions from them to have, as I mentioned before, money, a technical assistance, and protect the farm. We suggested in B20 that we need to be more innovative and funding of this money for making the transition. One of these ways, I know carbon credit is very, very important, but besides of carbon credit, we need to establish a payment for environment service. And then this will help accelerate the transitions. I strongly believe that food system, meat production, is part of the solution. We need to invest in agriculture in order to make this transition. And I'm so focused on this because 65% of the poor people work in agriculture, 65%. We have 1/3 of the population that suffer for food insecurity. If we transform this system, we can tackle the hungry, we can tackle the food insecurity, we can tackle the climate, and we are able to develop a new economy. It's good for everyone. It's important to be conscious on that. I mentioned that I was honored to be chair of B20, and we bring this project from the agriculture minister of G20. they accept 70% of a recommendation. Now, look for the G20, the expectation that the leaders of the country will be accept that. Because then you start to move on the solution for me, for the climate, for the food security.
I'm going to pivot to something based on something that you've mentioned here, Tomazoni, food insecurity. Marcela, how much of a role does that play in another problem that we keep talking about, which is migration, right? How much does hunger, food insecurity play into the patterns that you're seeing in immigration today?
Now, look, we have had migration throughout history, it's as old as history. And usually people migrate because of differential in incomes and because they're young, right? And our countries, we share that. The US and Brazil are both countries that have been strengthened through migration throughout their history. Then we see spikes of migration based on shocks. And that's what we're experiencing now. And basically the shock that we face is 8 million people who have left one country, Venezuela. There are other dynamics that are global, but that's one country that has, 25% of its population left. And most of that displacement has actually been faced by the region. 80% of that is of that displacement is in 4 countries in South America: Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil. So I think the Biden-Harris administration, realized that this is a regional challenge and it needed regional solutions. And under this LA declaration that the president signed a couple of years ago with 22 countries in the region, that's what we've been trying to do, to kind of row in the same direction. Because migration is manageable. And the pillars that we're working on together as a region in one of the most difficult topics and politically difficult topics, because it's so easy to weaponize migration, focus on, yes, working together on humane enforcement, dramatically expanding lawful pathways for migrants, and then working on the stabilization of migrants here in the region and providing them integration and legal status. And Brazil has been an incredible leader in that work. And together, as a region, these countries, over half of the countries that have signed the LA Declaration at the Summit of the Americas with President Biden, have regularization policies. 4.4 million migrants have been regularized inside of Latin America. So just to say, yes, we have shocks. We are facing the largest displacement of people in Latin America's history. But there is an incredible story in the making of how this hemisphere is working together to face this challenge.
And now we have in 2 weeks a big event looming over us, which are the US elections. How do you see that affecting that work that you're doing going forward?
Look, I think of all the topics that I've worked on in development, this is the one where politics and policy tends to be the furthest apart, because it is so easy to weaponize migration. And I think that if you actually, even though it is a topic that is high on voters' minds in the US, if you actually look into the polling, what Americans want is they want us to be able to secure our border. They want us to also, they know that we benefit from migration in our labor markets. And I think this is the approach that the Biden-Harris administration has tried to promote and has been successful at it, right? Migration has gone down in our southwest border by 50% in the last few months, not just because of our enforcement actions, but also because all of this work that we are doing within the region and pairing this strategy that has worked through historic spikes, right? Enforcement with giving lawful alternatives to migrants. And I think that the approach that the administration has taken will endure, right? The LA Declaration is owned by the region. The countries are the ones that are pushing these policies, and they're seeing that rowing in the same direction benefits them. The LA Declaration presidency has now been taken by Colombia. We have created a secretariat that runs with it. We have invested and announced in the last year $1.2 billion to help the region stabilize migrants. So I think we can be a country, the US, a country of laws, a country of an orderly border, and a country that still welcomes migrants. And I do think we have created the policies and the structures that will endure.
And Tomazoni, what about as a global company, global supply chain? Are you worried about potential tariffs if Trump wins the US election?
We are focused on the consumers. We are not see that one or another party win or won make change in our business. We focus to be more competitive, to produce more with less, because our mission is to feed the population in a growing population. We must to produce more food in a more sustainable way, in more affordable way. That for us, we focus on the things that we control, not the things that we are out of our control.
And Paul, to close out with you, thinking broadly about climate policy and sustainability globally, how do you see this US election?
Well, it's a crucial one, and not, I'm not an American citizen, but we are citizens of planet Earth, and America happens to be one of the biggest emitters of carbon, the highest per capita, the second highest in absolute. And we've seen the positive effects of the inflation.
Oh. We still have 1 minute and 36 seconds. Oh, there you go.
So sorry for the joke, but the only place that happened to me was in Iran. That's another story. But seriously, being the second biggest emitter, we've seen the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act, not only in the US, but actually galvanize people in different places in the world to get to this greener economy. What will happen is if you have a president that doesn't believe in climate change, that wants to actively support the fossil fuel industry, that actually doesn't believe in partnership. In fact, I went to the White House to try to convince him to stay in the Paris Agreement, and that was one of the most unpleasant meetings I had in my life. And doesn't believe in international cooperation to solve issues that we need to do together, then you can only say, Houston, we have a problem. Now, we can look at that for 4 years and then go back again, but you send the wrong signal to business. It's already starting to happen where some of the CEOs with a little bit weaker backbone or spine are starting to make different noises already again. And yeah, we like him because it's less regulation and a little bit less tax for me. But meanwhile, they're shooting themselves long-term in the foot. So we'll lose 4 years. The world will have millions more people suffering as a result of that. But we'll become more determined to move forward because there is no other option, unfortunately. Now, what we've seen in the US, more coal plants were retired under Trump because it made economic sense. So turning it back will not happen. But will it result in slowing down and less ambition from the private sector as a result of that? Definitely. And that's a shame. It's not a shame for some of these Americans that are pretty happy in where they are and have had possibilities to adapt and to protect themselves to a certain extent. Hurricane Helena showed how many people start to suffer in the US as well. But it's the millions of other people in countries that had nothing to do with this, that don't have adaptation, don't have access to financing, that will pay a dear price for this. No, I don't want to be part of that. And I hope many of the American citizens don't want to either. So let's decide what side of history we want to be in 2 weeks' time.
All right. That's all the time we had, unfortunately. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Andreas Stevas, Chairman, BTG Pactual, and Eric Schatzker, Editorial Director, Bloomberg New Economy.
Well, good afternoon once again, ladies and gentlemen. This is Andreas Stevas. Andre, let's start with the big picture. Pardon me. Wardrobe malfunction. I met yesterday with one of the biggest investors in Brazil, a billionaire with decades of success all over the world. And he told me that the future never seemed more dismal, gloomy. He's worried about tensions between the United States and China. He's worried about the shift of protectionism in the US and in Europe. He's worried Trump will win the US election and create chaos in geopolitics, and with it, of course, the global economy. You are arguably the most powerful investment banker in Latin America. What do you see when you look into the future?
I'm less gloomier than that. I think, of course, we have global geopolitical tensions, a lot of things to worry about. But generally, the world has been handling that. And I'm not necessarily bearish on geopolitical issues when you think about Trump election, right? I think Trump has been tough but responsible. And sometimes when you have confusion in the saloon, it's not necessarily bad to have someone arriving with unpredictable behavior can bring more predictable behavior of everybody else.
So should I interpret that as you seeing a Trump victory as a positive?
No, I'm just saying that you have a genetic view of bringing more unpredictable outcomes, and I don't think it's not necessarily true.
Unpredictability isn't that necessarily a bad thing?
Yes, that's my point.
So we have, of course, the US election coming up in 13 days, but there are two poles to this geopolitical tension we're talking about. There's the US on the one side, and the US economy, as you know, continues to do extremely well. Interest rates are coming down, inflation is moderating, the unemployment rate continues to be quite low. On the other hand, of course, we have China. And the Chinese economic model today looks a lot different than it did just a few years ago. Tell me what you expect from China.
In this case, I'm worried with both sides. Starting with China, I'm worried about the model. What drove this amazing 30 years of Chinese growth was a combination of big migration from rural areas to urban areas and the consequent urbanization of that, an amazing labor arbitrage, huge investments in infrastructure with fantastic productivity gains, and on the top of that, a very vibrant capitalism. When you look at China today, all of these factors offer some challenge, right? Labor cost arbitrage is not there anymore, or at least not in the same fashion, right? A blue-collar worker in China makes more or less the same than a blue-collar worker in Brazil or Mexico. No more migration from rural areas into urban areas, and no more consequent urbanization in the same velocity. And the marginal investment in infrastructure doesn't bring the same productivity. And regarding the amazing entrepreneurial environment of the last 30 years, also some shifts, some more prioritization on politics regarding the economy. And on the top of all of that, you also had a surprise in birth rates to the worst. So Chinese population is shrink. If you ask ChatGPT, what is the population of China in 2100, it will tell you 564 million people, which is a big challenge. So we had the package. Maybe it's the beginning of a reshift in the direction of economic priorities. We need to see, but I think we have challenge there. But we also have challenge in the US. And the challenge in the US for me is related to public deficit and the debate about that, or in better words, the lack of debate about that in the public campaign, right? It's a very high deficit with less buyers of US treasuries, and we don't see this debate happening. It's, in reality, even if you are the owner of the printer, there is a limit to print. So I'm worried about that with US.
So if on the one hand you have a very different Chinese economic model in which you lack some confidence, and you have a US deficit ballooning out of control, and the potential for the bill, if you will, to come due at someday in the not too distant future, what does the combination of those two things mean for the global economy, and perhaps more relevantly, seeing as we're sitting here in Sao Paulo, the economies of the global south?
I think generally these combinations bring volatility. And if you look this year, somehow that's what we are seeing when you look at US. We started the year pricing a 50 bips cut in March, with 7 other cuts in the yield curve. Then March arrived and no cuts, and gradually the other cuts disappeared from the yield curve. By mid-year, we had a view that no more cuts ever. Then 2 months later, and our fear was we are very close to a recession. And eventually we need an emergency cut, an intermittent monetary policy committee meeting of the Fed. And then suddenly, no, it's not close to a recession, but we got 50 bips cut in September meeting. 1 week later, the market was worried about eventually no more cuts this year. So it's an interesting scenario because it's amazing volatility of scenarios, and part of that driven by the Fed. And when you look at the underlying assets, the US economy, much less volatile than that. So it's an interesting landscape, probably related to what we discussed before.
When you say driven by the Fed, are you suggesting that the Fed is either over-communicating or miscommunicating?
I think certainly over-communicating, because when you are a central banker, and today the information that any central bank has is not that different than the market information. But if you over-communicate, you over-guide the markets in the best of your interests and objectives, you lose what is the most important point of observation, which is the market price. That's the most important piece of information. If you are over-guiding the markets, you are somehow losing that. And I think we are in a moment of global central banking that we are over-communicating, not necessarily miscommunicating, but we are over-guiding markets. I prefer a more quiet central bank and let the market provide us with a very important piece of information, which is the prices.
Most of the world's major central banks, including the Fed, are, of course, cutting interest rates as inflation subsides. The Banco Central do Brasil is going in the opposite direction. It's raising rates. And usually, when a central bank raises rates, the currency appreciates. But that's not what's happening here in Brazil. In fact, the real keeps getting weaker. What's wrong with this picture?
I think markets are more pessimist than the state of the economy in Brazil. Brazil will grow 3.1%, 3.2%, and very important, without any constraint in the external accounts. So current account deficit will be something around 1.5%. We have international reserves that are quite liquid, the US treasuries, low external debt. So it's an interesting balance. There is a lack of confidence about long-term fiscal results, which is we need to deliver. And regarding the interest rates hike, we are just in a different moment of the cycle. Brazil is with very tight unemployment, a very low unemployment, which is good for the economy, but maybe we are with inflation expectations slightly ahead of what they should be. So central bank is doing their job, moving back inflation expectations to the target, which is 3% in the case of Brazil.
Is fiscal credibility the underlying problem here?
It's we have, in a certain way, it's a similar situation than U.S., right? We have in this year a pretty similar number of nominal deficit to GDP, Brazil and U.S. The difference that we don't own a printer, and we need to be more rigorous than the U.S. regarding that. So we need to deliver about that. We need to be disciplined. But the good news about Brazil is that the fiscal deficit or the fiscal topic is being discussed every day in political campaigns, during the newspapers, in debates about that. And that's what I like. The first step to solve a problem is to identify the problem. And what scares me in the U.S. that even without many buyers of long-dated treasuries, you are not discussing the topic.
Roberto Campos Neto has been a stalwart of monetary rectitude here in Brazil. He has conferred enormous credibility to the central bank. Will his successor, Gilberto Galípolo, be as resistant to political pressures as Mr. Campos Neto has?
I think we are in an interesting moment of central bank in Brazil, or the monetary history in Brazil. First, Roberto was the first independent central bank. The independent, constitutional independent central bank in Brazil is recent. Roberto is the first central bank governor that runs an independent central bank. But in reality, for more than 20 years, including Lula's first two administrations, central bank was operationally independent in practice. For the last almost 3 decades, that's the logic in Brazil. So I think we'll have a smooth transition, and the credibility goes beyond the credibility of Roberto, but is from the institution.
You think there is enough institutional credibility? You know, I'll just remind everybody that it was only last week that once again, Donald Trump was talking to our own editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait, about how he wants to jawbone the Fed in this direction or that direction. Is that a possibility here too?
I think part of the job description of a president or any politician is to make comments about the scene. But honestly, I think central bank under this administration, the next or the previous, will take technical actions, and I don't have any doubt about that.
Let me ask you about the government of President Lula. Where is it getting things most right economically?
I think Minister Haddad, the finance minister, is doing a good job in identifying the necessity of us creating a fiscal framework that brings stability. Remember, Brazil was upgraded by 2 rating agencies, and most recently by Moody's, and we are one step to investment grade. We need to continue to deliver. And it's normal to have doubts. And we have a past of not necessarily fiscal discipline. So we need to deliver better results for the future. And I think Minister Haddad is absolutely aware of that.
Where is this government getting things most wrong?
I think it's still early on that, but I think honestly the government is doing a good job in creating the fiscal framework. And what I think we should do is I prefer that government tightens more fiscal policy in order of keep less tightened monetary policy. That's one thing. On the microeconomic level, we are in a tight labor market, and we created in Brazil a fantastic net of social support, which is an achievement for Brazilian society. But when you have zero unemployment, more or less where we are, it's time for us to release some of these policies that made a good job in the last 20 years in order to push people back to the formal labor market. So I would like to see these 2 moves, and I think it will be very healthy.
I'd like to ask you about the local financial services market. Your firm, BTG Pactual, is a giant in the wealth management business. As you know, asset management has been transformed in the United States and Europe over the past 15 years. Fees have collapsed. You can buy an index fund for just a few basis points. But here in Brazil, as I understand things, those funds are still pretty expensive, not index funds. Mutual funds, you still pay maybe even a couple hundred basis points to own an equity mutual fund, in excess of 100 basis points to own a fixed income mutual fund. Why are the fees so high?
Not BTG funds. They're very cheap and perform very well, and I encourage all of you to invest on that.
That is not the case across the industry, though. What is going to trigger the collapse, the compression in fees in wealth management and asset management that we've seen elsewhere in developed markets?
No, it's happening in Brazil also, right? You had a lot of democratization in terms of asset management and wealth management in Brazil, which is fantastic for the society. The concept of independent financial advisors, distribution network. There is a lot of competition in the Brazilian market, new fintechs, new companies, big companies that became public companies, digital banks that are very successful. I see a pretty vibrant financial sector here in Brazil, and competition will be there. Regulation is very advanced. You have peaks in Brazil that you don't have anywhere. You move money in Brazil much easier than in US and much cheaper than in US. So I think the financial infrastructure here is quite competitive.
Another phenomenon here is the recent movement, let's say, of investor capital out of hedge funds and into tax-free asset management products. And there's some concern in your industry about maybe the government eliminating some of those tax advantages. If that were to happen, and perhaps you can tell us if you think it's going to happen, would that spur yet another dramatic reallocation of investor capital here, and with what consequences?
I don't see this happening because I think the big move in terms of keeping these tax incentivized products under control already happened correctly, right? There was
It's a product of tax reform, right?
It's much similar, not that different from munis in US or REITs in US. So it's a similar constitution. The framework, the legal framework of Brazilian financial markets and US markets are not that differently. Here, I like the last change in regulation, and I think they were correct, produced by Brazilian SEC, Central Bank of Brazil, and I don't see big capital dislocations. I think we are going in the right direction there.
Brazil, as we have established in several conversations today, is a giant in renewable energy. Some 93% of all power on the grid is green. In theory, this country should be a magnet, right, for multinationals that want to build carbon-free supply chains and want to set up green factories. You would know, because of the firm that you run, are more companies actually looking at Brazil now, either to set up businesses or maybe to buy businesses here?
Yes. Yes, and I think that you can have some tectonic movements around that, and especially regarding the energy matrix that Brazil has. As you said, we have, depends on how you measure, 85 to 90% of the matrix is renewables, which means that we are a renewable, the largest renewable energy matrix in the G20, and especially with low subsidies, right? Because doing renewables in UK, it's possible, but quite expensive. In Brazil, it's not. And I think Brazil could be a global hub for data centers, for example. As you know, you cannot build data centers in Virginia anymore. You cannot build, or in UK, you take 2 years to link your data center to the grid. In Brazil, you have huge investment in transmission lines and renewable energy fully available, not expensive. And Brazil could be a very important hub for global data centers that will be needed globally.
When you say
that's
tectonic,
one of the opportunities.
One of the opportunities. So when you say tectonic, what is it going to take to bring about that kind of a tectonic shift? Foreign companies find it difficult to operate in Brazil. What does Brazil need to do to make it more attractive, more easier, if you will, for foreign companies to operate here?
Yeah, it's partially right, partially wrong, because if you look the last 20 years, FDI of Brazil has been one of the top 5 globally in the world, right? And we receive well American companies, European companies, Middle Eastern companies, US companies, and Chinese companies. So it's a good hub for FDI. And it has been like that through different cycles, different governments, different global perspectives. But of course, we could do more. And we are not ideal, far from ideal. I think we should have less taxes, simpler regimes, and easier way of doing business. We can improve in all of these fields. Part of that we are trying to do. We are in the middle of a tax reform in Brazil, not approved yet. As always, not ideal, but much better than the system that we have today. And it's a step. We need the other 19 steps to be ideal. But even so, we have been attractive for that.
Do you see those kinds of reforms, not the tax reform that's being discussed in Congress now, but the other 19 steps, as you say, being taken under this administration, or are you going to have to wait for the next government?
I think we have been doing reforms through administrations, right? If you look during President Temer, we did a very important labor reform. During President Bolsonaro, we did a very important social security reform. And now under President Lula, we are doing a very important tax reform. And that's, sometimes we don't notice. We complain, we demand, we try to do better, but we reach at the reasonable level of institutionalization, which means that you do what is needed. Doesn't matter who ideologically is in power. So I think we will complete the tax reform, and we will continue to do especially microeconomic reforms. So if you look also on this side, a lot has happened in Brazil, from the independent central bank to a lot of privatizations, concessions that are going on now under this government, under the previous government, and certainly under the next government. If you look in the last 3 years, we privatized the three out of the 6 largest state-owned companies, right? It's Sabesp 2 months ago, the largest water and sewage company in Brazil. Last year, Copel, the largest state-owned energy company, and 2 years ago, Eletrobras, which is the 3rd largest state-owned company. So, and honestly, well received by the society.
I have a question for you, Andrea, about a theme that has run throughout this conference. Last night, right here, in fact, in this room, Aloysio Mercadante, the president of Brazil's National Development Bank, described a quote-unquote difficult geopolitical scenario for countries in the global south like Brazil. Tell us what you think. How should Brazil position itself in this environment between where we started off the conversation between the US on the one hand and China on the other? Where does Brazil belong?
I think we should do what we have been doing, right? Sometimes we go a little bit more one side, a little bit more the other side, but if you look back, we have very good relationships to the US. Here we have our dear ambassador that we talk frequently. We have very good relationship with Europe, with Middle East, with China. And especially if you are a Chinese infrastructure company, an European industrial company, or a US service company, you are treated equally in Brazil. All of them will follow the same rules, will obey the same law. And that's, I think, what makes Brazil a neutral country at the end of the day. So culturally, we are open. Doesn't matter if you came from Middle East, China, or US, you'll be treated equally. So we'll provide service, you need to pay taxes, you get BTG advice, and you do good business in Brazil, and nobody cares if you are making money, you pay your dividends, and it will be welcome. And that's what makes Brazil eventually a winner in this big geopolitical dislocation of divisive world.
Andre, I'd like to thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Andreas Stevas.
Thank you.
And that, everyone, believe it or not, brings our program to a close. I want to say a few things, and I'll say them briefly. I want to thank you for attending, I want to thank you for participating, and I want to thank you for being and for becoming a member of the Bloomberg New Economy community. There are a few final things we'd like to ask before you go. We do try hard to deliver the best possible experience. I hope you feel the same way. But we're always open to suggestions for how we could do what we do even